The snow kept falling for 11 days straight, and on the 12th morning, Cornelius Van Houten watched from his window as the Hendrickson cabin roof collapsed with a sound like cannon fire, followed by the Miller place an hour later, then 3 more before sunset. His own roof, curved like an upturned boat and mocked by every settler in the valley, held firm under 4 feet of heavy wet snow that should have crushed it into kindling. Before we continue, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And if frontier survival stories like this one fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable. The winter of 1841 arrived early in the Wisconsin Territory, catching the Dutch settlement along the Fox River unprepared for what American cold could do. Cornelius Van Houten had experienced 16 winters in his life, 14 of them in the Netherlands, where winter meant rain and occasional frost, nothing like the bone-deep freeze that gripped the valley by late November. He had emigrated 3 years earlier with 47 other families from Gelderland, drawn by promises of fertile land and religious freedom. They had established their community 6 miles upstream from the nearest American settlement, building their cabins using techniques their fathers and grandfathers had used in the old country. The construction methods worked well enough in Holland. Peaked roofs with steep angles to shed rain, timber frames with notched joints, clay and straw chinking between logs. The settlement had grown to 63 cabins by the fall of 1841, arranged along both sides of the river in a pattern that reminded the settlers of villages back home. Each family had cleared fields, planted crops, established themselves with the quiet determination that characterized Dutch immigrants. They worked together during harvest, shared tools and labor, maintained their language and customs even as they adapted to frontier life. Cornelius was 29 years old that winter, unmarried, living in a cabin he had built with help from Peter de Vries, his closest friend in the settlement. The 2 men had known each other since childhood in Arnhem, had made the Atlantic crossing on the same ship, had claimed adjacent land parcels when the settlement was established. Their cabins stood 30 yards apart, connected by a worn path through the timber. Peter was married with 2 young children. Cornelius remained single, dedicated to the hard work of establishing his farm before taking on the responsibility of a family. The cabins they built followed the standard pattern. Logs roughly 12 inches in diameter, notched at the corners using the saddle joint technique, chinked with clay, mixed with straw and moss. The roofs were peaked, covered with split shakes made from cedar, angled steeply to shed water. A stone fireplace occupied one end of each cabin. A single door faced south. One small window allowed light and air. The structures went up quickly, with communal labor, typically completed in 5 or 6 days with 4 men working together. These cabins kept the wind out and the heat in adequately during normal winters. But the winter of 1841 would prove that adequate was not the same as sufficient, and that techniques perfected in the mild climate of the Netherlands could fail catastrophically under conditions the settlers had never imagined possible. Cornelius and Peter had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of frontier partnership that carried them through the seasons. They worked their trap lines together during winter months, checking beaver sets along the smaller creeks that fed into the Fox River. The fur trade supplemented their farming income, providing cash for tools, seed, and supplies they could not produce themselves. They split the work according to their strengths. Peter was better with animals, managing both their small herds of cattle. Cornelius had a talent for carpentry and metalwork, handling repairs and construction projects for both households. Their cabins stood as testaments to functional simplicity. Each measured 16 feet by 20 feet internally, with ceiling heights of 7 feet at the walls, rising to 9 feet at the ridge peak. The walls were constructed from white pine logs, abundant in the surrounding forest. The peaked roofs used the same materials, with rafters meeting at a central ridge beam that spanned the length of the structure. Cedar shakes covered the exterior, overlapped to shed water. The entire design, prioritized speed of construction and efficiency of materials over any other consideration. Inside Cornelius's cabin, the layout followed the same pattern as every other dwelling in the settlement. The fireplace dominated the north wall, built from river stones mortared with clay. A sleeping platform occupied the opposite corner, raised off the dirt floor on log supports. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, tools, and the few personal items he had brought from the Netherlands. A table and 2 chairs filled the central space. Hooks driven into the wall, logs held clothing, hunting equipment, and cooking implements. The cabin was dark, smoky, cold in winter, despite the fire, but it served its purpose. Peter's cabin was nearly identical, though more crowded with his wife Anna and their 2 children. The children slept in a loft space above the main room, accessed by a ladder. Anna maintained a small garden plot during summer months, preserved vegetables in clay crocks, spun wool from their sheep into thread for clothing. The family represented the future of the settlement, children born in America who would carry forward the community their parents had established. The work never stopped on the frontier. During summer months, both men cleared additional land, expanding their fields incrementally. They planted wheat, corn, potatoes, and vegetables. They maintained fences to keep livestock contained and wild animals out. They cut and split firewood for the coming winter, stacking cords of oak and maple to dry. They repaired tools, buildings, and equipment constantly. They hunted deer and elk to supplement their diet. They smoked and preserved meat for winter consumption. The partnership worked because both men understood the fundamental reality of frontier survival. One man alone faced overwhelming challenges. 2 men working together could accomplish what would exhaust a single person. They trusted each other completely, shared resources without counting costs, and knew that either would risk his life for the other without hesitation. That trust made the coming tragedy even more devastating. February arrived with temperatures so cold that spit froze before hitting the ground. The settlement hunkered down, venturing outside only when necessary to feed animals or gather firewood. Cornelius and Peter had agreed to check their trap lines every 3rd day rather than daily, the cold making the work dangerous and the beaver less active anyway. On February 9, 1842, Peter volunteered to make the check alone. Cornelius had developed a harsh cough, and Anna had insisted he stay inside rather than expose himself to the brutal cold. Cornelius spent the morning working by his fire, repairing leather harnesses and sharpening tools. Around midday, he heard Anna screaming. The sound cut through the cold air with terrifying clarity. He grabbed his coat and ran outside, following her voice to Peter's cabin. The roof had collapsed completely, the entire structure pancaked down to perhaps 4 feet of height. The ridge beam had snapped in the center, allowing the 2 roof planes to fold inward like a book closing. The weight of accumulated snow, compressed and heavy from repeated freeze-thaw cycles, had simply exceeded what the timber could support. Anna stood in the snow screaming her husband's name. Her children clung to her skirts, crying. Cornelius ran to the collapsed cabin and began tearing at the debris, throwing aside shakes and broken rafters. Other settlers arrived within minutes, all of them digging frantically. They found Peter under the center section where the ridge beam had failed. The massive timber had struck him directly, killing him instantly. His body was crushed, his face mercifully unmarked. He had been sitting at his table eating a midday meal when the roof came down without warning. They pulled him from the wreckage and laid him in the snow. Anna collapsed beside him, her wailing cutting through the assembled crowd. The children screamed for their father. The men stood silent, removing their hats, understanding that what had killed Peter could kill any of them. Every cabin in the settlement used identical construction. Every roof carried the same snow load. Every ridge beam bore the same impossible weight. Cornelius knelt beside his friend's body, unable to process what he was seeing. They had shared breakfast 3 days earlier, laughing about nothing important. They had planned spring planting, discussed buying a pig to share, talked about everything and nothing the way men do when time seems infinite. Now Peter was dead, crushed by the very shelter he had built to protect himself. The irony was obscene. They buried Peter 2 days later in ground frozen so hard they needed fires to soften the earth enough to dig. The funeral gathered the entire settlement on a hillside overlooking the Fox River. The Dutch Reformed minister spoke prayers in their native language, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Anna stood supported by 2 other women, her children silent now, shocked into numbness. The men lowered Peter's body into the frozen ground wrapped in canvas because the earth was too hard to dig a proper grave. They covered him with rocks to prevent animals from disturbing the site until spring, when they could complete the burial properly. Cornelius stood apart from the group, his mind unable to focus on the prayers or the ritual. He kept seeing the collapsed cabin, the snapped ridge beam, the impossible weight of snow that had crushed his friend. The image replayed endlessly. He had helped build that cabin. He had notched those logs, raised those rafters, installed that ridge beam. The construction had seemed solid, adequate, sufficient. It had failed anyway. After the funeral, he walked back to Peter's ruined cabin alone. The other settlers had cleared the debris enough to salvage anything useful, stripping the site of materials that could be reused. What remained was a rectangular outline of log walls, mostly intact, topped with broken timbers and scattered shakes. Cornelius studied the failure point carefully. The ridge beam had been white pine, roughly 10 inches in diameter, spanning 20 feet. It had snapped almost exactly in the center where the stress was greatest. He examined the break. The wood had failed in tension, the bottom surface pulling apart under the load. The top surface showed compression crushing. The beam had bent increasingly under the accumulated snow weight until the tensile strength of the wood fibers was exceeded and catastrophic failure occurred. The fracture was clean, sudden, total. One moment the beam was supporting the load. The next moment it was broken and everything collapsed. Cornelius walked through the settlement over the following days, studying every cabin roof with new eyes. He saw the same design repeated everywhere. Peaked roofs, ridge beams, angled rafters. Every single structure relied on the same principle. The ridge beam carried the weight, transferring it down through the rafters to the walls. If the ridge beam failed, the entire roof failed. There was no redundancy, no alternative load path, no safety margin. He began asking questions. How much snow was currently on the roofs? No one knew precisely. How much weight could the ridge beams support? No one had calculated. How close were other cabins to the same failure Peters had experienced? No one could say. The settlers had built using traditional methods without considering that Wisconsin winters bore no resemblance to Dutch winters. Cornelius realized something during those cold February days that changed everything. Spring arrived slowly, releasing the settlement from winter's grip by degrees. As the snow melted, Cornelius watched water running off the cabin roofs in streams, revealing the weight that had pressed down for months. He estimated the snow depth at its peak had reached nearly 3 feet of heavy, wet accumulation. That meant every roof in the settlement had been supporting thousands of pounds beyond what the structures were designed to carry. Peter's cabin had failed first, but it might not have been the weakest. It might simply have been unlucky. Cornelius could not stop thinking about roofs. He lay awake at night, visualizing the forces involved, trying to understand why peaked designs failed under extreme loads. During the day, he studied everything around him that successfully resisted weight and pressure. He examined the stone arch bridge that crossed a creek 2 miles from the settlement, built by earlier settlers. He noticed how the curved stones transferred weight outward and downward, how the arch shape itself provided strength that individual stones lacked. He studied the settlement's well, noting how the circular stone walls resisted the inward pressure of surrounding earth. He watched coopers making barrels, seeing how the curved staves were held in compression by metal bands, creating containers that could hold enormous internal pressure. He observed how boat hulls curved to distribute the force of water, How wagon wheels used curved wooden sections bent into circles for strength. Everywhere he looked, he saw curves providing structural advantages that straight lines could not match. The other settlers noticed his obsession. They saw him sketching on pieces of bark with charcoal, drawing curved lines and geometric shapes. They watched him spend hours staring at the remaining snow on north-facing slopes, calculating weights and angles. Some thought grief had affected his mind. Others assumed he was planning to leave the settlement, unable to cope with Peter's death. No one guessed he was trying to solve a problem that would save lives. By late May, Cornelius had filled dozens of bark sheets with sketches. Most were crude attempts to translate what he was seeing into cabin roof designs. He drew arched roofs, domed roofs, curved roofs of every description. Each design faced the same fundamental challenge. Wood did not naturally form curves. Stone could be cut into wedges for arches. Metal could be heated and bent. But wood was either straight or it was broken. Then he remembered watching Cooper's work, specifically how they created the curved barrel staves. They selected wood with straight grain, cut it to specific dimensions, then soaked and steamed it before bending it gradually over forms. Cornelius spent 3 days in June watching Henrik the Cooper work in his shop at the edge of the settlement. The old craftsman had learned his trade in Rotterdam and continued it in Wisconsin, making barrels for storing grain, salted meat, and preserved vegetables. His work required precision and an understanding of wood behavior that most carpenters lacked. He selected white oak for its tight grain and natural resistance to moisture, cut staves to precise dimensions, then shaped each piece to create the barrel's curve. The process fascinated Cornelius. Henrik soaked the rough-cut staves in water for 2 days, softening the wood fibers. Then he placed them in a steaming chamber built over a fire pit, exposing them to sustained heat and moisture for several hours. The combination made the wood pliable. Henrik then placed each stave into a bending form, a curved wooden template, and slowly forced the wood to match the curve. He secured it with clamps and let it dry for a week. When removed from the form, the stave retained its curved shape permanently. The key insight came when Cornelius watched Henrik assemble a completed barrel. The cooper arranged the curved staves in a circle, fitting them tightly together. Then he drove metal hoops down over the assembly, drawing the staves into compression against each other. The hoops provided no structural strength themselves. They simply held the staves in their curved arrangement. The strength came from the curves themselves, each stave supporting its neighbors, the circular shape distributing force equally around the entire structure. Cornelius asked Henrik why barrels were strong. The cooper shrugged, explaining it was simply how barrels were made, how they had always been made. But Cornelius pressed, asking what would happen if you made a square barrel with straight sides. Henrik laughed, saying it would leak and fall apart under any pressure. The curves were essential. The compression was essential. The shape itself created the strength. That night, Cornelius drew a new sketch. Instead of trying to curve an entire roof, he drew a series of parallel curved ribs, like barrel staves, running from one wall to the other. The ribs would be identical, each one a perfect arc. They would be spaced close together, perhaps every foot or so. Over these ribs, straight planks could be laid perpendicular, following the curve but not requiring the planks themselves to bend significantly. The result would be a roof shaped like a barrel laid on its side, cut lengthwise. He studied the sketch by firelight, working through the structural logic. Snow falling on the curved surface would press downward, but the curve would redirect that force into compression along the ribs, exactly like the barrel staves. The ribs would transfer the force to the walls as downward and slightly outward pressure. Unlike a peaked roof where the ridge beam could snap, this design had no single failure point. If one rib cracked, the adjacent ribs would continue supporting the load. The design seemed sound in theory, But Cornelius had never seen a building with a curved roof. He had no examples to study, no precedent to follow. Cornelius made the mistake of sharing his idea at a community gathering in late June. The settlement held these meetings monthly to discuss shared concerns, plan communal projects, and settle disputes. After the routine business concluded, Cornelius stood and described his curved roof concept. He explained the barrel principle, the compression forces, the elimination of the ridge beam weakness. He showed his sketches, pointing out how the ribs would distribute weight. He spoke with conviction, certain that others would see the logic. The reaction was not what he expected. Jacobus Mulder, a farmer who had been in the settlement since its founding, laughed outright. He asked why anyone would waste time bending wood when straight rafters worked perfectly well. He pointed out that Peter's cabin had stood for 3 years before failing, that the collapse was simply bad luck, an unusually heavy snow year. He suggested Cornelius was allowing grief to cloud his judgment. Others joined the criticism. Hendrik Janssen, who owned the largest farm in the settlement, said curved roofs were foolish, that wood was meant to be used straight, that bending it weakened the fibers. He claimed the process Cornelius described would take months for a single cabin, time that could be better spent on productive work. He questioned whether bent wood would even hold its shape over time, suggesting it would straighten out and collapse. Dirk Bakker, the settlement's blacksmith, pointed out the practical problems. Where would Cornelius get the clamps and forms needed to bend dozens of identical ribs? How would he lift curved timbers into place without them breaking? What would keep the ribs from twisting or warping? How would he attach shakes or planks to a curved surface? Every question highlighted difficulties Cornelius had not fully considered. The minister spoke last, suggesting that traditional building methods had served humanity for centuries, that innovation for its own sake was prideful, that Cornelius should focus on accepting God's will regarding Peter's death rather than trying to prevent what might be divine judgment. The theological argument carried weight in the deeply religious community. Several men nodded agreement. Cornelius left the meeting humiliated. His idea, which had seemed brilliant in isolation, had been thoroughly dismantled by practical objections and social pressure. He walked home in the summer twilight, questioning his own judgment. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps he was wasting time on an impossible project. Perhaps he should simply rebuild using conventional methods and trust that lightning would not strike twice. But that night, lying in his cabin, he thought about Anna and her 2 children living in a borrowed room in someone else's house because their home had collapsed and killed their father. He thought about the sound of that ridge beam snapping, the crash of the roof falling, the finality of structural failure. He decided that mockery was preferable to doing nothing. Cornelius began his experiments in July, working alone in a clearing behind his cabin. He started with small test pieces, cutting sections of white oak roughly 2 feet long and 2 inches square. He had watched Henrik work, but watching was different from doing. His first attempts at steaming resulted in scorched wood when he placed the pieces too close to the fire. His next attempts left the wood too dry because he failed to maintain consistent steam pressure. He built a proper steaming box after a week of failures, constructing it from scrap planks sealed with clay. The box sat above a fire pit with a water pot feeding steam through a small opening. He learned to maintain the right temperature by adjusting the facteur and monitoring the steam output. Wood needed approximately 1 hour of steaming per inch of thickness. His 2-inch pieces required 2 hours minimum. The bending process proved even more difficult. His first form was simply a curved log he had found in the forest. He tried forcing hot steamed wood around it and securing it with rope. The wood cracked immediately, splitting along the grain. He realized the curve was too severe, the bend too abrupt. He needed a gentler arc, something that asked the wood to curve gradually rather than fold sharply. He spent 2 weeks carving a bending form from a massive piece of oak, creating a smooth arc that would become the template for all his roof ribs. The curve was approximately 8 feet in radius, creating a gentle arch that would span the width of a cabin while providing enough height at the center. The form weighed nearly 80 pounds, too heavy to move easily, so he built his steaming operation around it. With the proper form in place, his success rate improved. He learned to clamp the steamed wood gradually, starting at one end and working along the curve rather than trying to force the entire piece at once. He discovered that wood with straight, tight grain bent more reliably than pieces with knots or irregular patterns. He found that white oak worked better than pine, ash better than either, but ash was less available in the surrounding forest. Each successful bend required careful timing. Remove the wood from the steam too soon, and it would crack. Leave it too long, and the wood became too soft, losing structural strength. Clamp too tightly, and the wood compressed and split. Clamp too loosely, and the curve would not hold. He ruined dozens of pieces learning these lessons, burning through his supply of suitable wood before achieving consistent results. By late August, Cornelius could produce reliably curved pieces that held their shape after drying. Each one took approximately 6 hours of work from rough-cut lumber to finished curved rib. He needed at least 20 ribs for a cabin roof, meaning 120 hours of bending work alone, not counting the time required to select and prepare the wood. The first full-length rib took Cornelius 9 days to complete. He selected a white oak that had grown straight and tall, competing for sunlight in a dense section of forest. The tree was approximately 14 inches in diameter at the base, with minimal taper over the first 20 feet of trunk. He felled it carefully, cutting close to the ground to maximize usable length. The tree crashed through the canopy, landing precisely where he had planned. He stripped the bark using a draw knife, working the blade along the grain to remove the outer layer without gouging the wood beneath. The bark came off in long strips, revealing the pale wood underneath. He marked the trunk at 8-foot intervals, allowing extra length for trimming. Then he began the laborious process of splitting the trunk into workable sections. Using iron wedges and a maul, he drove splits along the grain, separating the trunk into quarters, then eighths. Each section was roughly 4 inches by 4 inches in cross-section, small enough to steam, but large enough to retain strength after shaping. He selected the straightest section, one with perfect grain running the entire 8-foot length without knots or irregularities. He shaped this piece carefully with his draw knife, creating a rectangular timber exactly 3 inches by 4 inches, with the 4-inch dimension oriented to provide maximum strength when bent into the curve. The shaping took 2 full days, removing wood carefully to maintain straight edges and flat surfaces. Any deviation would create weak points or prevent the ribs from fitting together properly when assembled. The steaming required his largest box, built specifically for full-length pieces. He steamed the timber for 5 hours, monitoring constantly to maintain proper temperature and moisture. When ready, the wood was almost too hot to touch, even through leather gloves. He lifted it from the box and moved immediately to his bending form. The bending happened slowly over 30 minutes. He started at one end, clamping it to the form, then worked along the length, pulling the wood into the curve incrementally. He could feel the wood resisting, the fibers compressing on the inside of the curve and stretching on the outside. The timber creaked and groaned, but did not crack. He placed clamps every 6 inches, drawing the wood tight against the form. He left it clamped for 2 weeks, longer than the small test pieces, wanting to ensure the curve set permanently. He built a shelter over the form to protect it from rain. He checked it daily, watching for any signs of splitting or failure. The wood dried slowly, changing from the wet pale color to a deeper amber as moisture evaporated. When he finally removed the clamps and lifted the rib free, it held its curve perfectly. 8 feet long, curved in a smooth arc, strong and true. He set it against his cabin wall and stepped back to examine it. Cornelius spent September and early October producing ribs, working with obsessive focus. He established a production rhythm that allowed him to complete approximately 2 ribs per week, cut and shape the timber, steam for 5 hours, bend and clamp, wait 2 weeks for drying. He staggered the work so that while some ribs were drying, he was preparing others. By mid-October, he had 23 finished ribs standing against his cabin wall like giant curved bones. The settlement watched his work with continued skepticism. Men passing by his cabin would pause to examine the ribs, shaking their heads at the wasted effort. Women mentioned to Anna that Cornelius was spending his time on foolishness instead of preparing properly for winter. Children dared each other to ask him why he was building a boat so far from water. The mockery had evolved from initial dismissal to routine entertainment. Jacobus Mulder stopped by one afternoon in late October, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but actually to voice his concerns. He pointed out that Cornelius had not cut adequate firewood for winter, that his cabin repairs were incomplete, that he was neglecting practical preparations in favor of his curved roof obsession. He suggested, with apparent sincerity, that Cornelius should abandon the project and focus on survival. Winter was approaching, and foolish projects killed men as surely as cold weather. Cornelius listened without arguing, then returned to his work. He had made his decision. He would build the curved roof or die trying. The mockery no longer bothered him. He had moved beyond caring what others thought. The only validation that mattered would come when snow fell and roofs either stood or collapsed. He began construction of the new cabin in early November, aware that he was starting dangerously late in the season. A traditional cabin could be completed quickly, but his design required careful work that could not be rushed. He selected a site 50 yards from his current cabin on slightly higher ground with better drainage. He cleared the area of brush and small trees, leveled the ground, and began laying out the foundation. The walls would be traditional log construction, the same technique everyone used. He saw no reason to innovate where the existing method worked adequately. He cut white pine logs, notched them at the corners using saddle joints, and stacked them into walls 16 feet by 20 feet. The work went quickly with techniques he had practiced for years. The walls reached their full height of 7 feet within 2 weeks. The critical difference came with the top course of logs. Instead of simply laying them flat, Cornelius shaped the upper surface of each wall log into a curved channel that would receive the ends of his curved ribs. The first rib installation proved more difficult than Cornelius had anticipated. The curved timber weighed approximately 60 pounds, awkward to handle alone, and needed to be positioned precisely to seat properly in the channels he had carved. He built a temporary support post in the center of the cabin, creating a pivot point where he could rest the middle of the rib while maneuvering the ends into position. The technique worked, but barely. He wrestled the first rib into place over the course of 2 hours, adjusting and readjusting until both ends seated correctly. He secured each rib by drilling holes through the curved ends into the wall logs below, then driving wooden pegs through to lock everything together. The pegs were oak, shaped to fit tightly, and driven with a mallet until they could go no deeper. Each rib required 4 pegs, 2 at each end, angled to prevent the rib from lifting or shifting under load. The first rib stood alone, arcing across the empty cabin like a rainbow made of wood. The second rib went faster, taking only an hour to position. He placed it 18 inches from the first, measuring carefully to ensure consistent spacing. The third and fourth ribs followed the same pattern. By the end of the first day, he had 4 ribs installed, and the structure was beginning to take its final shape. The curve was visible now, undeniable and strange. Anyone walking past could see this was not a traditional roof. Over the next week, Cornelius installed the remaining 19 ribs, spacing them 18 inches apart from front wall to back wall. The repetitive work created a rhythm: lift, position, adjust, drill, peg, measure, repeat. His hands developed new calluses. His back ached from the constant lifting, but the structure grew steadily, rib by rib, until the entire framework stood complete. With all ribs in place, the cabin looked like the skeleton of some enormous animal, its curved bones arcing overhead. The visual effect was striking and unsettling. Nothing in the settlement looked remotely similar. The curved lines seemed wrong to eyes accustomed to right angles and straight edges. Cornelius understood the aesthetic objection, but aesthetics were irrelevant. The question was whether it would hold. The next phase required covering the ribs with planks to create the actual roof surface. He had prepared these planks during the summer, splitting cedar logs into boards roughly 6 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch thick. Cedar was light, naturally resistant to rot, and readily available. He had 40 planks, each 8 feet long, stacked and drying since August. He began laying planks perpendicular to the ribs, starting at the bottom edge of the curve on one side. Each plank spanned across multiple ribs, following the curve naturally without requiring the plank itself to bend significantly. This was crucial. The ribs provided the curve. The planks simply followed it. He secured each plank with wooden pegs driven through into the wall. Ribs beneath, 2 pegs per rib, creating hundreds of connection points. The work went slowly because precision mattered. Gaps between planks would allow water penetration and weaken the structure. He fitted each plank carefully, sometimes shaving edges with his draw knife to achieve tight contact. By late November, the planking was complete, covering the entire curved surface with overlapping cedar boards. Cornelius had worked from bottom to top on each side, overlapping the planks like shingles so water would run down the curve without penetrating between boards. The overlapping pattern meant using more material than a simple flat covering would require, but it provided superior weatherproofing. The roof now formed a continuous curved shell, smooth and unbroken from wall to wall. The final waterproofing layer required materials he had prepared months earlier. During summer, he had collected birch bark from trees in a swampy area 3 miles from the settlement. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He had carefully peeled large sections, keeping them flat under weights to prevent curling. Now he laid these bark sections over the planked surface, overlapping them generously, creating a second complete barrier against moisture. Over the bark, he spread a mixture of pine tar and clay that he had boiled down over several days. The mixture was thick, sticky, and remarkably adhesive. He worked it into every seam and gap, sealing the entire surface. The smell was intense, sharp, and resinous, but the result was a roof that would shed water completely. Finally, over everything, he laid sod cut from the meadow behind his cabin, living grass and soil that would root and create a living roof surface. The completed structure was unlike anything in the settlement. The curved roof rose approximately 4 feet above the wall tops at its highest point, creating a distinctive profile visible from a distance. The barrel shape was obvious now, impossible to miss or misinterpret. Cornelius had built exactly what he intended, an upturned boat of a roof that defied every convention of frontier construction. He moved his possessions into the new cabin in early December as the first serious snows began falling. The interior felt different from his old cabin, larger somehow despite identical wall dimensions. The curved ceiling created a sense of space that the peaked roof had lacked. But the difference that mattered most was structural, invisible, residing in the physics of how the curved ribs would handle weight. As he arranged his belongings and settled into the new space, Cornelius felt doubt creeping in for the first time since beginning the project. He had committed months of work and significant resources to an untested design. He had endured mockery and skepticism from his entire community. He had built something that looked wrong, that violated every principle of traditional construction, and now, as winter arrived with its inevitable snow loads, he would discover whether his obsession had produced innovation or simply wasted months of his life. He lay in his bed that first night, listening to wind against the walls, staring up at the curved ribs overhead barely visible in the darkness. The structure was solid, well-built, carefully constructed. But was it strong enough? Would the curved ribs distribute weight as he believed they would, or would they simply snap under load like any other timber? The first significant snow arrived on December 8, 1842, dropping 6 inches of heavy wet accumulation overnight. Cornelius woke to white landscape and immediately went outside to examine his roof. The snow lay evenly across the curved surface, a smooth white blanket following the contours of the barrel vault. He walked around the cabin, studying it from every angle, looking for any sign of stress or deformation. The ribs showed no movement. The walls remained plumb. Everything held exactly as it should. Over the following week, additional snows added to the accumulation. By mid-December, approximately 18 inches of snow sat on the roof, representing several hundred pounds of weight distributed across the structure. Cornelius spent hours inside, listening for sounds of stress, creaking timber, or shifting joints. He heard nothing unusual. The cabin was silent except for wind and the occasional pop of settling logs, normal sounds that every cabin made. He compared his roof to others in the settlement. The traditional peaked roofs also held the snow without apparent difficulty. 18 inches was well within normal range for Wisconsin winters, nothing exceptional or dangerous. The real test would come if snow accumulation exceeded what peaked roofs could safely support. That might not happen this winter. It might not happen for years, or it might happen next week. Weather was unpredictable, and extreme events arrived without warning. Jacobus Mulder visited in late December, ostensibly to check on Cornelius, but actually to see the completed cabin. He examined the curved roof from outside, walking around the structure with obvious skepticism. Inside, he studied the ribs overhead, reaching up to push on them, testing their rigidity. He asked how much weight Cornelius thought the roof could hold. Cornelius admitted he did not know precisely, that the design was experimental, that only actual snow loads would provide definitive answers. Jacobus pointed out that traditional roofs had centuries of proven performance behind them, that innovation without necessity was foolish risk-taking, that Cornelius had gambled months of work on unproven theory. He suggested that if the curved roof failed catastrophically, Cornelius might not survive to regret his hubris. The warning was delivered with apparent concern, but Cornelius heard the underlying satisfaction. Jacobus wanted the curved roof to fail, wanted validation that traditional methods were superior, wanted proof that innovation was dangerous foolishness. After Jacobus left, Cornelius sat by his fire, considering the criticism. The traditional roofs did have proven performance. They worked adequately under normal conditions. Peter's cabin had failed, but that might have been anomalous, a combination of factors that would not repeat. Perhaps Cornelius had overreacted, building an elaborate solution to a problem that did not require solving. Perhaps the curved roof was unnecessary complexity that would eventually prove its own weakness. But then he remembered the sound of Peter's ridge beam snapping, remembered the collapsed cabin, remembered his friend crushed beneath timber that should have protected him. Traditional methods worked until they failed, and when they failed, people died. Innovation might be risky, but accepting known weaknesses was arguably riskier. December 23rd brought a temperature drop so severe that metal tools became painful to touch and exposed skin froze within minutes. The thermometer outside the trading post registered 18 degrees below zero by morning, the coldest temperature anyone in the settlement had recorded. The cold persisted through Christmas, through New Year, into the first week of January 1843. Smoke from chimneys rose straight up in the still air, freezing into visible columns that hung above the cabins like markers of habitation. On January 7th, snow began falling, not the light, fluffy snow of typical winter storms, but heavy, wet flakes that accumulated rapidly and compressed under their own weight. The snow fell continuously through the day and into the night, building at a rate of approximately 2 inches per hour. By morning of January 8th, 14 inches of new snow covered everything, adding to the 18 inches already present from earlier storms. The snow did not stop. It continued through the 8th, through the 9th, through the 10th. The settlement disappeared under white. paths between cabins filling as fast as they could be shoveled, livestock shelters buried to their roof lines. People ventured outside only when absolutely necessary, struggling through thigh-deep drifts to reach animals or gather firewood from quickly diminishing stockpiles. Cornelius watched from his window as the accumulation on his roof grew steadily. 2 feet, then 2.5, then 3. The weight was becoming substantial, thousands of pounds pressing down on the curved ribs. He went outside during brief breaks in the snowfall, measuring the depth with a marked stick, calculating approximate weight based on the wet, heavy nature of the snow. At 3 feet depth, he estimated the roof was supporting nearly 6,000 pounds of snow distributed across its curved surface. Inside the cabin, he listened constantly for sounds of stress. The ribs occasionally creaked as temperature changes caused wood to expand or contract, but these were normal sounds, not indications of structural failure. He examined the ribs where they seated into the wall logs, looking for any movement or separation. Everything remained tight and properly positioned. The curved design was performing exactly as he had hoped, distributing the massive weight through compression along the arcs rather than concentrating stress at any single point. Other cabins in the settlement were not faring as well. On the morning of January 11th, with snow still falling, Cornelius heard a deep, booming crack that echoed across the valley. He knew immediately what the sound meant. A roof had failed somewhere in the settlement. Within an hour, word spread that the Hendrickson cabin had collapsed, the ridge beam snapping under the accumulated load. The family had evacuated just minutes before, warned by ominous creaking sounds. No one was injured, but their home was destroyed, and they now crowded into a neighbor's already packed cabin. The snow continued falling through the 11th, adding another 8 inches. 3 feet and 8 inches total accumulation. The weight on every roof in the settlement now exceeded anything the structures had been designed to bear. The question was no longer whether roofs would fail, but how many and how soon. Cornelius watched from his curved roof shelter, knowing the real test had finally arrived. The Miller cabin collapsed on the afternoon of January 11th. The sound, carrying clearly across the snow, muffled settlement. Then the Van Daren place went down an hour before sunset, the ridge beam snapping with a report like a gunshot. 3 families were now homeless in the middle of the worst winter storm anyone had experienced. They crowded into neighboring cabins, bringing what possessions they could salvage, sleeping on floors, overwhelming the limited space and resources of their hosts. January 12th brought more snow and more failures. The Decker cabin collapsed at dawn. The Visser place went down at midday. By evening, 7 cabins had lost their roofs, and the settlement was approaching crisis. People were running out of places to shelter. Cabins built for single families now housed 8 or 10 people, consuming firewood at unsustainable rates, straining food supplies, creating conditions where disease could spread rapidly. The snow finally stopped on the morning of January 13th, but the damage continued. The Boss cabin, which had survived the worst of the storm, collapsed that afternoon as the family was attempting to shovel snow off their roof. The added weight of people on the structure provided the final stress that broke the ridge beam. Garrett Boss fell through the collapsing roof and broke his leg, the first serious injury. His screams brought neighbors running through the deep snow, struggling to reach him and pull him from the wreckage. Hendrik Jansen's cabin, the largest in the settlement, began showing signs of imminent failure on the 14th. Ominous creaking sounds prompted him to evacuate his family and their livestock. They watched from a safe distance as the massive ridge beam, nearly a foot in diameter, slowly bent under the load. The beam held through the day and into the night, creaking and groaning, but on the morning of January 15th it finally gave way. The collapse was spectacular, the entire roof folding inward and taking portions of the upper wall logs with it. By January 16th, when the immediate crisis stabilized, 17 cabins had completely lost their roofs. Another 6 showed serious structural damage to roof systems, with cracked ridge beams or separated rafters that made the buildings unsafe to occupy. 5 people had died, 3 crushed in sudden collapses they had no time to escape, 2 from exposure after their cabin failed, and they could not reach shelter quickly enough in the deep snow and extreme cold. The settlement, that had numbered 63 cabins, now had effectively 40 cabins capable of providing shelter. 90-plus people were homeless, crowded into remaining structures, consuming resources at rates that would exhaust supplies long before spring. The community faced potential starvation, certain misery, and possible additional deaths if more roofs failed or if disease spread through the overcrowded conditions. Cornelius watched all of this from his barrel-roofed cabin, which continued to hold firm under 4 feet of compressed snow. His roof had not creaked, had not shifted, had shown no signs of stress whatsoever. The curved ribs distributed the impossible weight exactly as physics dictated they would. Every neighbor who had mocked his obsession now looked at his intact cabin with expressions ranging from disbelief to barely concealed envy. On the morning of January 17th, Jacobus Mulder knocked on Cornelius's door. The man who had been most vocal in his mockery now stood in the snow, his own cabin destroyed 3 days earlier, his family sheltering with relatives in cramped conditions. He asked, with obvious difficulty, whether Cornelius had room to take in additional people. His wife and 3 children were sleeping on the floor of a cabin already housing 11 people. The conditions were intolerable. Cornelius stepped aside and allowed the family to enter. His cabin, built for 1 person, now housed 5. It was crowded but manageable, far better than the situations in other overcrowded shelters. Jacobus said nothing about the curved roof, did not acknowledge his previous skepticism, simply helped his family settle into the available space and thanked Cornelius quietly. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. People who had laughed at the barrel roof now sought shelter beneath it. Cornelius took in as many as his cabin could reasonably hold, eventually housing 9 people in a space designed for 1. They slept in shifts, shared the limited floor space, rationed firewood carefully. The curved roof overhead became their salvation, the strange design they had mocked now literally keeping them alive. The settlement's leadership, such as it was, organized a meeting on January 20th in the Trading Post, one of the few large structures with its roof still intact. Nearly every adult in the settlement attended, crowding into the space to discuss survival strategies. The immediate crisis was shelter. People needed roofs over their heads. The temperature remained brutally cold, and while the snow had stopped, existing accumulation would not melt for weeks or months. The discussion quickly turned to Cornelius's cabin. How had it survived when larger, more substantially built structures had failed? What was different about the curved design? Could the technique be replicated quickly enough to provide emergency shelter? Hendrik Janssen, whose massive cabin had collapsed, asked Cornelius to explain the structural principles involved. Cornelius stood before the assembled community and described what he had learned. The peaked roof design concentrated stress at the ridge beam, creating a single point of catastrophic failure. The curved barrel vault distributed stress through compression along the ribs, eliminating the single failure point. Traditional roofs fought against the weight of snow. Curved roofs used the weight to strengthen the structure through increased compression. The principle was simple physics, the same reason arches had been used in construction for thousands of years. He explained the construction process, the wood-bending techniques, the rib spacing requirements, the importance of proper curves and solid connections. He offered to teach anyone who wanted to learn, to share every detail of what he had discovered through months of obsessive work. He asked for nothing in return. The knowledge was freely given to anyone who needed it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly every man in the settlement wanted to learn the technique, wanted to build barrel-roofed cabins to replace the structures they had lost. The temperature finally moderated in late January, rising above freezing during daylight hours. The snow began melting slowly, revealing the extent of destruction across the settlement. Collapsed roofs showed as flattened rectangles of broken timber and torn shingles. The debris fields told stories of structural failure. Ridge beams snapped cleanly in their centers, rafters splayed outward, where walls had given way, personal possessions crushed and scattered beneath fallen timbers. Cornelius organized work parties to begin salvaging usable materials from the collapsed cabins. Undamaged logs could be reused for walls. Broken rafters and ridge beams were cut into firewood. Metal hinges, nails, and tools were carefully recovered and redistributed. Nothing was wasted. The settlement had limited resources, and rebuilding would require using every scrap of available material. The first new cabin began construction in early February on the site of Jacobus Mulder's collapsed home. Cornelius supervised, teaching the wood-bending techniques to 5 men who would become the core group of builders. They constructed a communal steaming box large enough to handle multiple pieces simultaneously, carved bending forms using Cornelius's original as a template, and established a production system that allowed them to produce curved ribs much faster than Cornelius had, working alone. The work was slow initially, as the men learned unfamiliar techniques. Steaming times had to be precise. Bending required careful incremental pressure. Each rib needed to match the form exactly, or it would not align properly during assembly. But the men were motivated by the memory of their collapsed homes and the knowledge that traditional construction had failed catastrophically. They learned quickly, and within 2 weeks they were producing quality curved ribs on a schedule that allowed completion of 1 cabin every 3 weeks. Jacobus's cabin was finished in late February. The barrel roof rose above new log walls, curved and strange-looking, but unmistakably solid. The family moved back into their own space, ending weeks of crowded cohabitation with relatives. The cabin was warm, dry, and secure. More importantly, it was built using principles that had been proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Other cabins followed through March and into April. The settlement reorganized its labor, with some men focused on wall construction, while others specialized in rib production and roof assembly. The communal effort brought the community together in ways that prosperity had never achieved. Shared tragedy and shared solution created bonds stronger than simple proximity. By May, when spring truly arrived and the last snow melted, 12 new cabins had been completed, all using the barrel vault design. Another 8 were under construction. The settlement had not fully recovered, but it had survived, and the rebuilt structures were demonstrably superior to what had been lost. The curved roofs became the visible symbol of adaptation and resilience. Cornelius found himself in the unexpected role of teacher and expert. Men who had mocked him now sought his advice on every detail of construction. He answered their questions patiently, demonstrated techniques repeatedly, helped solve problems as they arose. He took no pleasure in being proven right, felt no satisfaction in the vindication. Too many had died, too many families had suffered. The innovation had come too late to save Peter, too late to prevent the winter's catastrophes. But it would save future lives, and that knowledge provided meaning to the months of obsessive work. Word of the settlement's experience spread through the Wisconsin Territory during the spring and summer of 1843. Traders carried stories of the catastrophic winter and the curved roof innovation that had saved lives. Other settlements, particularly those in heavy snow regions, sent representatives to examine the barrel-vaulted cabins and learn the construction techniques. Cornelius received visitors from communities 50 miles away, men who wanted to see for themselves whether the curved roofs were as effective as reported. The technique spread organically, adopted by practical-minded settlers who understood that frontier survival required using the best available methods regardless of tradition. By the winter of 1843 to 1844, barrel-roofed cabins were being built in settlements across southern Wisconsin and into Michigan Territory. The design evolved slightly as different builders adapted it to local materials and conditions, but the core principle remained consistent. Curved ribs distributing weight through compression, eliminating the single-point failure of ridge beam construction. The winter of 1843 to 1844 brought heavy snows again, though not as extreme as the previous year. Several traditional cabins in neighboring settlements lost their roofs. Not a single barrel-vaulted cabin failed. The practical validation convinced remaining skeptics. By 1845, the curved roof design had become standard practice in snow country, recommended by territorial authorities and taught to new settlers arriving from the east. Cornelius continued living in his barrel-roofed cabin through the 1840s. He never married, never started the family he had once planned. He farmed his land, trapped during winters, participated in community life with quiet consistency. He was respected, but not celebrated, known as the man who had developed the curved roof, but not treated as someone special. He preferred it that way, uncomfortable with attention, satisfied with the knowledge that his obsession had produced something genuinely useful. The settlement prospered as the Wisconsin Territory developed towards statehood. New families arrived, additional land was cleared, roads were built, connecting previously isolated communities. The Dutch character of the original settlement gradually diluted as Americans, Germans, and Scandinavians moved into the region. But the barrel-roofed cabins remained, distinctive markers of the community's history and adaptation. In 1854, Cornelius sold his farm and moved to Milwaukee, seeking opportunities in the growing city. He worked as a carpenter, building conventional structures using standard techniques, never mentioning his innovation unless directly asked. He lived simply, saved his money, and died in 1869 at age 57 from pneumonia. He was buried in a city cemetery under a simple marker that listed his name and dates, nothing more. Back in the Fox River Valley, the cabins he had inspired continued standing. By the 1880s, when the frontier had closed and the region was fully settled, many of the original barrel-vaulted structures remained in use, serving as barns, storage buildings, or homes for new generations. A few stood into the 20th century, curiosities that prompted questions about their unusual curved roofs, and the story of how one man's response to tragedy had changed building practices across an entire region. The innovation persisted, not because Cornelius sought fame or profit, but because it solved a real problem better than existing methods. That was enough. That was everything.